What is up, YouTube? Kronos here, and welcome back to another PSO2 guide video. So this is going to be, I guess, a part 2 to my meta weapon analysis video that I made when I ran through a bunch of weapons, talked about potentials and kind of how things work and what's useful to use. Unit video to come after this is done, actually, right after this video is finished, so look forward to that. So I made a video earlier about my skill tree that should be uploading. It's currently the 3rd of June. That should be ready to go by the morning. It's like 3 o'clock in the morning right now when I'm recording this, by the way. So yeah, doing these late at night. So if I sound a little quieter, I apologize in advance. I don't want to wake anyone else up at the moment, but we're gonna run through the weapon analysis, and I'm just doing kind of like a quick little run through because a few new weapons came out, and it's really obvious what weapons are useful and what ones are mostly trash. I do want to also append what I was mentioning a bit earlier because it's something that was brought to my attention in the comments, and it is worth mentioning. When my original meta weapon video, I explained a couple of weapons that were useful to use while leveling. That opinion was slightly skewed because of the class that I played. I level as a bouncer, so my first mag that I created was dex based, meaning I had extra dexterity fairly easy and fairly often to be able to equip the weapons that I suggested. Now, granted, to be perfectly honest, in most situations, any weapon will do until you get to your 13-star weapons. In reality, you're going to look for a solid 12-star weapon at some point when you hit level 60 roughly, and then you'll move on to your 13-star weapons. You don't want to invest too far into them, the weapons beforehand, because it's just going to cost you money that you really don't need to spend. Basically, get a 12-star that you can use, rank it up as much as possible that seems decent enough, and eventually you'll use that as fodder. Fairly common weapons are Nox weapons, just because they use defensive stats, which you'll just get as you level. So something to keep in mind, and I did want to make sure to mention it beforehand because it was unfair of me to always recommend those weapons since I had a bit of a skewed perspective. However, if you play Bouncer or Braver and have a Dex Mag, then it makes it super easy. I actually know a couple of my friends who are just straight up making a Dex Mag, not only for leveling those classes, but to make it easier to level literally anything else, since you're usually able to equip most of the things you want to use with Dexterity, and that extra 200 Dex can make you equip things fairly early on. So without further ado, let's jump into this. So we have a new set of weapons. Now, this is what I meant by don't invest too heavily into certain weapons, because newer weapons are going to come out that actually have a bit of longevity. And the first few sets actually have already shown that. So we've got the Ray weapons that have been released into the game itself, which come from the Rising Weapon Badge shop, the Gix weapons, the Nemesis weapons, and the Slave weapons. So, odd name. But, oh, I'm sorry. Also, there was a couple of these other weapons that were released, other 13 stars. I'm not going to go too far into these. In almost all categories, these kind of suck. Unfortunately, I mean, they're all class weapons. Their stats are pretty garbage, and their potentials are also pretty garbage. So, I mean, they just look kind of cool. They were a badge weapon on the Japanese version of the game itself, so we really didn't hold on to them very long. They were useful to grind for and just have access to, but it was from a time that I played the game that I played the game very little at that time when this was a thing. So I didn't really use these weapons at all, so I can't really talk to how useful they were back then, but they're pretty much useless right now. You're mostly just going to sell them on the market, and hopefully someone else buys them thinking they want to use them, or they pick them up because they want to form change a weapon into this. And that's just what they have access to. Also uses dexterity, so all class weapon, dexterity, you're seeing a pattern. So there's that. But speaking to these weapons, so this is what I meant by longevity in a weapon, right? So Lightning Espada, it's nice because it's all class. And you can use it leveling other classes, but in reality, it kind of loses its usefulness outside of just that, right? It's mainly just a stat stick, decent on healing and all those sorts of things. And the Sword of Revulsio is just, it doesn't have any sort of usefulness after. You just kind of use it for a stat stick and some damage. However, Ray weapons. They're a bit weaker, keep that in mind, but these aren't the joke. This isn't my final form. That's what the Ray weapon is basically telling you. Ray weapons actually will upgrade into another weapon type, which I will show you from the Japanese version of the wiki. So we're going to let that load. It usually takes a few minutes. Actually, I don't think it'll start loading until I open this up. Yeah, it won't. So we're going to pop into the Japanese version of the wiki for just a second so you guys can see what these weapons will turn into. So we go to swords. And we're gonna pop down to 13 stars. Yes, the Japanese version of the game has a ton of weapons, but they have a ton of bloat. Let's see. So yeah, there you go. Crowed Edge, still just as useless there for the most part. If I can find, where are the ray weapons? Here we go. Ray Sword. So the Ray Sword still exists. It's still about the same on damage for the most part, from what I can tell. Let's scroll here. Yeah, still looks to be the same stats for the most part. Fairly useful. Does have a set effect, it looks like, with the arm unit, which I don't know if the wiki has this yet. Doesn't look like it shows it. Might have a set effect with the arm unit. I'll have to check. I actually have the arm unit. I lucked out and got a drop. But the reason why these weapons are so useful is because if we scroll down, you see this sword here that looks fairly similar. Is called the Union Sword. Now, the Union Sword gets a bit of a buff on damage, 1640, versus the ray weapon. Where did it go? Was like 15 and some change, 1525, which is some benefit, right? It's basically, it's moving forward and how useful it actually is. However, it isn't just the ray weapon and by itself. Eventually it upgrades into that Union weapon. So it has a bit of longevity. This isn't the best example of a weapon that's actually fairly useful. The next weapon I'm going to show you guys is a bit more useful in a sense, and it's actually currently the best in slot weapons for most classes. I think almost all of them. So we're looking at these here. We've got Gix, Nemesis, and Slave. As you can see, they're fairly substantial with their raw stat damage. Now, this is of course the calculation at plus 35, which when you get these, they drop. They're not part of a weapon badge shop. You will be able to plus 35 them immediately, and they will have maximum element, which is really, really nice. So Gix weapons are not terrible. They're decent stat sticks. The biggest problem with them is it increases your power over time from 6 to 20%, which is awesome, over 70 seconds. Once it's maxed, it will remain at that 20% until you consume a mate item. Now, remember, if you guys watched my my video talking about subclasses, or my video talking about like building your tree, automate is something that's fairly used by a lot of classes, right? And automate does count for using a mate item, meaning that if you have to heal yourself with automate, or if automate automatically heals you, you drop back down to 6%. So this isn't the best for most classes. The classes I can think of off the top of my head that would be able to use these are a hunter that's specifically spec'd into guard stance and what is it? Iron Will, Never Give Up, or Stalwart Spirit, I believe it's what it's called in NA. But Iron Will and Stalwart Spirit, since you don't use a mate item to heal, usually you're healing off of your parries from being in guard stance, which is a fairly strong tree. Technically, if I remember correctly, it's the strongest way to play hunter, as long as the enemies you're fighting are aggressive enough to continuously keep your guard stance boost up for parrying their abilities. So it can be used there. However, technically it's still outclassed by the Nemesis caliber and the Slave caliber. So, and this is more or less the same thing across all weapons. It's a smaller jump for other weapons, like the rifle specifically, and the Nemesis rod is a bit different, but we'll get to that in a second. So what these weapons have on them, not only are they ridiculous stat sticks, they give you 17% increased power at +3. We're only taking the level 3 version of this into account because you should be upgrading your weapons. But 17% power. You get a barrier that gives you 40% damage reduction and 20% PP cost reduction. It disappears on taking damage and regenerates after 30 seconds, meaning if you're not taking any damage, you have 40% damage reduction when you do take some damage, and 20% PP reduction, which is huge. It's very, very good. For most classes, that's pretty awesome. Now, if you're a bit more unlucky like I was, and you only got the slave weapon to drop, it's not the end of the world. Technically, you want both of these, and I'll explain in a minute. Slave weapons increase power by 17%. It generates a barrier that negates the knockback. You have 20% automatic PP recovery and 30% attack PP recovery. While you have the barrier up, it disappears upon taking damage. So it is more PP recovery technically. However, it isn't PP reduction. So certain classes are better at PP recovery versus PP reduction. So it just depends really. Technically, this also has a bit more damage on it. And this also has a better, what is it? It's called an SAF, a special ability factor, which you unlock by hitting the weapon to +35. It just allows you to augment this for free, basically, always at 100%, unless you're upslotting. So this does have a better SAF, not by much, it's only 7 pp, so like whatever. Versus total res by +3. Some people would argue this is a better choice, but Purifying Shield is a bit better in my opinion than the Shield of Temptation. So thing is this is pretty much the common process with almost every tree of weapons. You've got something here that's really not all that important. It's a decent, stat stick for whatever it is, but it's not that much stronger. Like, I mean, look, it's weaker than the freaking Nox weapon, and it's not much, like, it's stronger than Sigma weapons, but they're meant to be all class weapons. They're usually meant to be that strong in the first place. And that's pretty much the case across the board. There may be a couple of honorable mentions, but in reality, if you guys are looking at like what the quote unquote meta choices are going to be, in most cases, it's going to be either Nemesis or Slave. And pretty much it's mostly Nemesis just because of Purifying Shield. Gix is just pretty much outclassed. It's not something you're going to use really at all. Mars weapons are kind of cool at a point. What's weird is it says they support S2s, but I don't think we have those in the game yet. So that's a bit odd. We're not going to talk about those because that's completely different than what we would have in the game at the moment. And their bonus isn't that great. It's outclassed completely by Slave and Nemesis weapons. Now I'm going to go into why. Oh, let me touch on something really quick because you're probably asking, but what about rifles? What about rods? The TLDR on rods is because of the PP management. For rods, the Nemesis rod is going to be your best in slot. It's just the new best in slot weapon itself. Does that mean that you're terrible if you're using a Psycho Wand? No, not really. It's still a really great weapon to use for now. But 1597 compared to 1775, it just doesn't match up. So it's going to be better. So just keep that in mind. Also, if you guys are looking for where to find these, Nemesis weapons drop from Nefarious, Slave weapons drop from Lilipa. From what I have seen personally, and what I've experienced, and what I've seen in the drop tables, I don't know why these still say both. I haven't been able to find out where I can submit information to tell them it's different or it's wrong. If it is wrong, maybe I'm wrong about this, and I just have gotten super unlucky, and we haven't seen them pop up in both. But I'm pretty sure it's Nemesis and Nefarious, Slave and Lilipa. So there's that, and then there's also the Elder Rifle. The Elder Rifle is a little bit strange. So the Elder Rifle is weaker, but it's only weaker by a small percentage is what I'm understanding, is that even with the reduced amount, because if you look at the actual difference in range attack power, you still have 1451. The difference is not by that much. It's 1594, which is a sizable amount, but because you're using moving snipe with the Elder Rifle, because it's useful on single targets with, I can't remember the name of the PA, but it's one where you slide forward, kicking and shooting. Like you kick forward and you kind of shoot where you slide across the ground. It's really, really strong. And you can also still use moving shoot with Positron, or moving snipe with Positron Blast if you use it right. It's still fairly strong. So what I would say is, if you happen to get a hold of one of these rifles, if you're really hurting for money, sell them. But if you can hold on to them, they would be relatively useful in the future. Just test, I would say, find out, maybe talk to other rangers around, see what they kind of come out with. But I'm pretty sure the Nemesis rifle is going to end up winning out in the end. Now, the reason I say both weapons are useful, and I'm going to go over this relatively quickly, is because of a mechanic that we got on JP. Now, things could change. It could be a bit different, but what we ended up with on JP, these weapons existed. So what you'll find is, on JP, there's weapons that are considered NT weapons, or new type weapons. There was a different type of grinding system that existed back in the game a while back, where it was just RNG based. You would grind and you had a chance for it to increase. And if it didn't increase, you just lost the money in grinders that you invested at the time. So you'd keep going and going and going and going and going until it actually pushed it all the way up, right? You'd grind your weapon to +10, and then you would actually reset the weapon back to level 0, and you would unlock the level 1 version of the potential. And then you would do the same thing over and over again until you got it to level 3. And once you got it to level 3 at +10, it was at its max. That wouldn't go up any higher than that. So it was level 3 potential +10. That would be the max of the weapon itself. So what you'll find when you're looking at JP is you'll find these weapons that are labeled new type weapons. New type weapons have the grind system that we currently have as base on North America. So if you see, we have Lightning Espada NT. If we go to swords, our Lightning Espada is just called Lightning Espada because we don't have the old type weapon grinding system. So one thing that they released for players that had these weapons, because you notice there's weapons, invade and austere weapons, were a way to take older weapons they were using. If you look, there's a Nemesis caliber and a Slave caliber. Notice how they're much weaker than we currently have. They had a way for them to upgrade these weapons towards going into invade. I believe it was into austere, not invade. I don't remember the exact way this worked out. I believe it was, yeah, an exchange series. But it would go into invade and eventually austere weapons. Now, they also provided a way to upgrade these older weapons into the new type versions of these weapons further down the line. And what you ended up with our first set of 15 stars we had, or some of our first sets of 15 stars we had, there were 3 of them. There was, let me see, where can I get to them so I don't pass them? Okay, so yeah, there was the Atlas EX, the Lightstream, I believe is what it was at the time. Was it Lightstream? I want to say it was Lightstream, yeah. The Lightstream weapon and the Austere NT. Now, it was the new type version of the Austere, so it was a way to upgrade an older version of the Austere. Now, if you guys realize, if we go back to our weapons, we only have the regular versions of them. And if we go back to the NT versions, I'm going to scroll back to 13 stars. I think I might have passed them actually, hang on. Being prepared would be way too easy. Yeah, so if we're looking at the stats on the NT versions of the weapons, they closer resemble what we have here, right? So they're pretty much just the NT versions of these weapons. So what I'm assuming is going to happen is that we're going to take these weapons and upgrade them into the 15-star versions later on down the line. The NT weapons just into straight up, the regular weapons into just straight up austere weapons. Of course, we're probably going to go through in the invade process. I don't remember if it's like invade or if it's the Ares plus the Nemesis and Slave going into invade and then into austere. But there's like a process that you work with Zeke of trading in weapons towards upgrading them in the next process. So it's just something to keep in mind. They're good to hold on to. And if you happen to just luck out, really your only question to yourself is, do you need the money to make right this very second? Or do you want to hold on to them to make a quick 15-star when they first come out? Sometimes having multiples of weapons is not a bad thing, even if your class only uses 1 weapon or 2 weapons here and there. You have the abilities to change them into different types at a certain point. So different weapon categories that we have available to us later on down the line. I don't remember if it was available for austere weapons, but it might be something nice to have if you say play Hunter and maybe make an austere, like an austere sword, and end up saying, well, you know, I have a sword, I still need to make a spear, which is really good for a Hunter to have. You can play sword only, but a partisan is also really great for Hunter to have. It's one of its best weapons that it has access to for just raw damage outside of parrying things. Of course, sword ends up winning if you're blaze parrying everything, or ignition parry for those who play JP. But partisan's a really good weapon to have as an offhand weapon, just to go ahead and use for just raw damage when you're not dealing with an aggressive enemy. Having access to making multiple different types of weapons, or multiples of the same type, just to have a different element, is always useful to have. Alternatively, you can also make about, from what I understand, maybe close to 15 to 40 mil right now off of these weapons because people are buying them for that much. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, these weapons drop. So yeah, this one's correct. Corruption Nefarious, Corruption Lilipa. They drop from the ultimate quest. You have to be at least level 70 to do them. And if you're getting absolutely destroyed by those quests, it's pretty much mostly everyone. A lot of those monsters do a lot of damage, so it's something to keep in mind. Hopefully this was helpful to you guys. If you have any questions, feel free to toss them in the comments below. I just wanted to talk about these weapons and kind of give you guys an example of what I was talking about when I say not to invest too heavily into certain things, because some things are going to be useful in the future, other things won't be. If you guys do have any questions, toss them in the comments. I think I'm now repeating myself. If you guys like the video, go ahead and toss it a like. It's super, super helpful. Helps the algorithm for YouTube because for some reason they prefer likes over anything else. And subscribe if you want to keep up with content whenever I happen to actually release it. Anyway, guys, be safe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.